All right, we're going to go over viruses, and it's kind of interesting when we talk about viruses because we have to remember that a virus is not living. And so when we talk about the kingdoms, we're talking about the five kingdoms, and we do not mention viruses. However, viruses act a lot like bacteria in the way that they make humans sick and the way that they do things. So, of course, right now it's very interesting to be talking about viruses because of COVID. So we'll kind of make some connections there and talk a little bit more about that. But the one thing you have to remember is that a virus is not alive, okay? So it's a microscopic particle. We call it a pathogen, something that causes disease. But it gets inside of our cells and it destroys the cell. And so it needs to have a host to reproduce. So guess what the host it uses is? Your cells and mine. And so it gets inside and it ends up making your cells its own cells, essentially. So a host is an organism that a parasite takes food or shelter from. So in this case, the virus needs you to be able to reproduce and me, and it uses our cells. So why aren't they alive? That's an important thing to remember. They are not alive because they have to have a host to reproduce. They do not reproduce like other living things do. And when we talk about what makes something alive, like we did earlier this year, to be alive, you have to be able to reproduce on your own. And so they are not alive. They don't grow, they don't eat, they don't break down food, they don't use oxygen. They do have protein and genetic material. And so they act alive, but they really are not. So that is important to note. So we group them by their shapes. They have four shapes, which we'll talk about in a minute. We also talk about them in terms of the diseases they cause. We look at what we call their life cycle, even though they're not alive, and the type of genetic material that they contain. So if we look at the shapes, remember we just talked about the shapes of bacteria, but there are four shapes of viruses. And when we look at them, it makes sense to us. So again, these are microscopic. So these are microscope pictures. The first one is what we call crystals. So if you've heard of polio, which we are all vaccinated against, polio is a crystal-shaped virus. And so it looks a lot like a crystal. The spheres, which should look very similar to the shape of one of the bacteria that we talked about, the cocci shape, these are viruses, though, that cause, if we obviously have heard of the influenza, right? Influenza looks like this, so does COVID. I would bet, and I don't know this for sure, that COVID is a spherical virus, okay? HIV, which causes AIDS, is another virus you may have heard of. Those are all sphere-shaped. So that should look familiar to us if we've seen what COVID looks like. Cylinders should look a lot like the bacilli, right? The rod-shaped, right? Virus that is rod-shaped is called cylinder virus. And some examples of that, I don't know if you've heard of it, but the tobacco mosaic virus that attacks tobacco plants looks like that. If we were to use a microscope, we would see that. And then finally, spacecraft. Take a look. They look like spacecraft, right? And so that is why we use that terminology with them, because it's very, very similar to what a spacecraft looks like to us. So those are the four shapes of viruses. Now, some common viruses, I mentioned a few. Obviously, SARS, COVID, which is what we're dealing with right now in our world. The common many strains of influenza, which are also starting to ramp up at this time of year. If any of you guys have ever had warts or canker sores, chickenpox is something that most of us are vaccinated against today. And HIV and AIDS is also a common virus that you may have heard of. So how do they reproduce? They are not alive, let's not forget, so they don't reproduce on their own. But what they do, it's pretty amazing. This is showing you kind of a cartoon of it, right? So the virus finds a host cell, so a cell in your body, right? And if that's your DNA in there, what it does is it enters your cell and then it injects its own genetic material into the cell. So then once the genes are inside, if we look at number 3 here, they take over the direction or the kind of workings of the host cell and they turn it into a virus factory. So now you can see these viruses being produced, right? Then this new virus breaks out and starts to go to other cells and infect it. So that's how it works. Eventually, hopefully, your body fights it off, right? Like it does anything else, like influenza, you feel cruddy for a while, COVID, but sometimes it can be more serious and your body doesn't handle it as well. So it's important to note that it just depends on kind of your body and what's going on with it. Now, some important things that we need to connect here. I mentioned when we talked about bacteria that we treat bacterial infections with antibiotics, right? So if you have a bacterial infection, your doctor is going to say, here's some medicine, and it'll get better in a few days. If it's a virus, we don't really have antibiotics or something to treat a virus. We have stuff that can help your virus be like less hard on your body, and it might help your body fight it more, but there's nothing that we really are able to take that cures us like an antibiotic does. And for example, with COVID, right now we're using medicines to boost our immune systems currently, but there isn't an antibiotic. Those are only for bacterial infections, okay? So there really isn't a cure. Your body just fights it off and eventually, hopefully, overcomes it. Now, we do have some vaccines for viral infections, just like we have some vaccines for bacterial infections. But remember, a vaccine prevents, it does not treat it. So once you have the flu, you don't get a flu vaccine, right? And so you want to get a vaccine before you get it. And right now we know in the world we're working on vaccine for COVID that hopefully people will be able to take so that they don't get COVID, but it's not ready yet. It takes time. So is there a vaccine for everything? No. Every year, if you get a flu shot, some people do, you are looking at getting a shot of a vaccine which has the most probably, several strains of what the doctors in the world think will be the worst influenzas. So there are many different flus, right? And so they kind of say, well, this year we think these are going to be the bad ones. So they inject them into your arm usually, and it tricks your body into thinking that your body has had that. So you might feel kind of crummy for a day, but you're not really getting particles of the virus or the bacteria in this case. With COVID, it would be a virus. But with the flu, it's a virus too. And so your body is being tricked into thinking it has had it. And so you get what are called antibodies against it. Now, some people say, well, I had a flu vaccine and I still got the flu. Well, the reason that you may have gotten the flu is because you were not vaccinated for the particular strain that you got, right? So it's possible. It's a guessing game. Vaccines help for, symptoms and stuff like that, or make it less worse sometimes. But usually if they're right, you won't get that type of flu influenza. So that's kind of how a vaccine works. We can talk more about that. But the thing is, you cannot have a vaccine if you're already infected, right? It only prevents, it does not, if you've already got, for example, COVID or the influenza, you really can't go in and get that vaccine again and hope that it's going to help you get better if you're already sick. So that's an important piece to remember. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we come back together.